Good morning, everybody. My name is Ramya Amuthan, and I will be your MC for today's event. Welcome to the Indian Residential Schools Legacy Speaker Series with Bob Watts. We're really appreciative of your time, and this is a really important time that we live in right now, where we want to educate our community, ourselves, about the issues faced by Indigenous peoples here in Canada. I want to start off with a land acknowledgement for us, as we are on land that is not ours. I acknowledge my presence on land that has been the home of Indigenous peoples and nations long before colonial documentation of time. Specifically, the Huron-Wendat, the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Anishinaabe, as well as the Haudenosaunee people who continue to live and work here in Toronto, also known as Toronto. This territory has been under the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples, and this is an agreement for peaceful sharing of land and resources. In this spirit, I wish to share this virtual space with you today that we're not sharing just within Toronto, but around the country and around the world, as well as our resources and learnings that we will 100% have with each other for the next hour and a half. I want to now welcome the president. Well, actually, before welcoming the president, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. As I said, my name is Ramya Amuthan. I am the co-host and co-producer at Kelly and Company, which is an afternoon show on Accessible Media Inc. We create and curate conversations and content for people with disabilities across Canada, and I'm really honored today to be the MC at this event with you. As I said, this is an important time for us to be learning and to be talking about Indigenous peoples' challenges and conflicts that we have because of our historical representation of Indigenous peoples. There's been a lot of stories told in the past year, year and a half, and much longer than that. But in my lifetime, I've been seeing and hearing so many tragic and terrifying things that are going on with our relationship with Indigenous communities here in Canada. And especially to acknowledge the horrifying events going on with residential schools and finding the unmarked graves of children of residential schools in British Columbia and beyond. And it really does make me emotional to talk about this because I just feel like we don't know enough. We don't know enough about what we're going through, what people around us and our neighbors, our Indigenous neighbors and brothers and sisters are going through. So that's why it's important to have this event today, to talk more about it, to listen to each other, to listen to our neighbors. And I'll be saying that a lot throughout this hour and a half. So, but for the time being, I'll pause my introduction and introduce the president of the Canadian Tamil Congress, and this is Mr. Sivan Ilango, for the event's welcome address and to share his thoughts of the purpose of today's gathering, because we all have our personal reasons for being here and we want to acknowledge that. So please help me welcome Mr. Sivan Ilango. Thank you.
Thank you, Ramya. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of Canadian Tamil Congress, I am pleased to welcome all of you to today's event. We at the Canadian Tamil Congress recognize the importance of learning about the history, traditions, practices, and culture of Indigenous people. Therefore, we, in partnership with our affiliated organization, Center for Leadership and Innovation, organized a cultural exchange event to learn about Indigenous culture, practices, and customs. Over 130 Tamil Canadians attended this two-day event in Tyandiana Mohawk territory in March of 2018. The recent discoveries of unmarked graves of children near former residential school have highlighted the need for all Canadians to hold Canada and the Church accountable for a long and hidden history of oppression and discriminations against Indigenous people. The residential school system in Canada was created to isolate Indigenous children from their own culture and religion in order to integrate them into the dominant Canadian culture. The residential school system harmed Indigenous children significantly by removing them from their families depriving them of their native languages and exposing many of them to various abuses. In light of the lack of education on this topic in the wider Canadian community and within the Tamil community, we are hosting today's event, which we believe would be educational for all participants. We are also pleased to announce that the beneficiary of 2021 Tamil Canadian Walkathon will be Got Downey Venjak Fund, a First Nations charity. We are thankful to Mr. Bob Watts for taking time to speak to us today and all the great work he has done and continues to do for the betterment of Indigenous people. We are also thankful to Ramya Amudan, presenter, producer at Accessible Media Inc. for hosting today's event. Once again, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sivanilenko. We really appreciate you and your support system for putting this event together. And that is the president of the Canadian Tamil Congress, Mr. Sivan Ilango. I'm going to tell you a bit about our next guest, and she's going to be introducing our keynote speaker for today. Malika Wilson is the senior counsel at Nova Wilson, at Nova Wilson LLP. Malika has served as the assistant Deputy Attorney General, Civil, I'm having a lot of trouble with my words today, of the Government of Ontario for over 8 years. She was the Senior Appellate Litigation Counselor with the Ontario Government for more than 30 years, participating in over 20 notable cases at the Supreme Court of Canada and the Ontario Court of Appeal. She specializes in human rights, Indigenous, constitutional, corporate, and labor law, and other complex litigation. Throughout her career, she has been a champion of diversity and inclusion, something we really need to talk about today. So let's welcome Miss Maliha Wilson, who will introduce our keynote speaker, Mr. Bob Watts. Thank you for coming, Maliha.
Thank you very much, Ramya, for that kind introduction. Gives me great pleasure to introduce my good friend of long-standing, Bob Watts. By way of introduction, Bob Watts is a much sought-after expert in Indigenous policy, negotiations, training, and conflict resolution. He's the former interim executive director of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which examined and made recommendations regarding the Indian residential school era and its legacy. Bob led the process, supported by an excellent team and many organizations from across Canada and internationally, to create the policies and processes in order to firmly establish the Commission. He also served as the Chief of Staff to the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Phil Fontaine, where he was a member of the team that negotiated the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, the largest class action settlement in Canadian history. His public service includes Assistant Deputy Minister of the Government of Canada and Senior Executive in Ontario. Bob is a graduate of the John F. Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University, and Fellow at the Harvard Law School, where he researched and lectured on the role culture plays in conflict. Bob has had the benefit of excellent Indigenous mentorship and Western learning, which allows him to work well in both worlds. Some of his Indigenous learning has focused on medicine plants, traditional songs, traditional environmental knowledge, and leadership. Bob has led the negotiations of co-management agreements, helped build strong corporate partnerships, and has led processes focused on strategic plans and community development. In 2019, Bob served as the Chief of Staff to National Chief Perry Bellegarde and played a key role in historic budget allocations and the passage of Bills C-91 and 92. Currently, Bob is the Vice President of Indigenous Relations at the NWMO and an adjunct professor and distinguished fellow at Queen's University, Kingston, Ontario, where he developed one of the first graduate-level courses on reconciliation in the country. Bob is a board member with the Consensus Building Institute, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and with the Indigenous Advanced Education and Skills Council. He is also the chair of the Downey Wendeck Fund and chair of Reconciliation Canada. Bob is a recipient of the Inspired Award for Public Service and recently received an honorary doctorate of laws from McMaster University. He has taught, debated, and lectured at a number of universities in Canada and the United States. He is from the Mohawk and Ojibwe nations and resides at Six Nations Reserve, Ontario. Bob carries and honors his Ojibwe spirit name, Tall Pine, and is a member of the Bear Clan. And with that, thank you so much, Bob, for agreeing to speak to us. And we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Chimigwech Nyawagoa Malaha, for that beautiful introduction. And Ramya, thank you for starting this off in such a good way. I really appreciated your opening comments and that land acknowledgement. Sivan, President, it's such an honor to meet you, and I'm really thrilled to be with all of you this morning and to spend a bit of time talking about reconciliation, talking about how we got to where we are at today, and some ideas on moving forward. I want to start off a little bit differently than what I usually do, and just to think about that land acknowledgement that Ramya offered, and that importance of recognizing Indigenous territory. And it reminds me of a few years ago, some of my students, former students from Queen's University approached me, and they said, we'd like to have lunch with you. I was working in Toronto, they were living in Toronto. And so I said, sure, happy to reconnect with you. So we organized lunch, nice place, downtown Toronto. And I said, so we got caught up. And I said, so what's going on? They said, they were all Muslim students. And they said, we've been talking with folks in our community about reconciliation. And some of our elders and some of our leaders, they say, we got to be careful with this, that it's really not our issue. And it's really an issue with the Christians and the Indigenous people, or maybe the white people and Indigenous people. And they said, what do you think about that? And I said, I think that everybody who's in this country, whether you've been here one day or you've been here for generations and generations, that everybody has benefited from the exploitation of Indigenous land. Everybody has benefited from Indigenous people being moved to the sideline. Everybody has benefited from our culture being outlawed, our spirituality being outlawed, from us living in poverty, that everybody's benefited from that. So my sense would be that everybody has a part to play in reconciliation, because we're all part of those issues and the complexity that exists today in terms of the relationship between Indigenous people and the rest of Canada. We're all implicated in that. And whether it's, through Indigenous relations with the government, pretty much everybody votes for the government. So it's people that all of Canada have put in power to make these laws and to make these policies that have dispossessed Indigenous people. So I said, my sense is that everybody's implicated. It doesn't mean that you're guilty of something, and it doesn't mean that you should be shamed into doing something, and it doesn't mean that you should be blamed for what's happened. But in terms of how we create a different future and how we teach our children and how we ensure that Indigenous people are able to benefit and to be not live lives in poverty marked by undrinkable water, terrible housing conditions, that we're all part of that solution. We all have a role to play. And when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission a few years ago gave their final report, they gave us 94 calls to action. These weren't recommendations, they were calls to action, called upon all of us to act. And there's a call to action for everybody. Doesn't matter whether you're a teacher, a baseball coach, university professor, corporate executive, public service executive. There's something in those calls to action that each and every one of us could look at and say, you know, I can do something about that. So we're all part of the solution. We all need to stand shoulder to shoulder in terms of how we move forward. But part of the question is, how did we get to this place where we even need, in Canada, we even needed a Truth and Reconciliation Commission? So I want to start off with a little bit of history and maybe just a little bit of Indigenous worldview, so you have some appreciation and some of it may resonate with you. As we have many Indigenous cultures and nations across this country and across North America, dozens of different languages, some so distinct from each other that there's no words that are the same. It would be kind of like, you know, Chinese and French, that sort of diversity. And diversity in terms of spiritual beliefs and cultural beliefs. But one thing is pretty central in terms of most Indigenous peoples in the Americas, and that's our relationship with the land. And we talk about that land, we talk about the different worlds of creation. Talk about the mineral world, the world of the rock and of sand and of soils and clays, all of that makes up the mineral world. And we acknowledge that that's an order of creation. Creator put that there. And we talk about the plant world, the grasses, the trees, the shrubs, the flowers, the herbs, on and on. And we think of that as a world of existence, the world of the plant kingdom. And we think about the same thing for the animals, the ones that fly, the ones that swim, the ones that crawl on the ground, the ones that crawl in the ground, all those different parts of the animal kingdom. And we think about that. We think about all of those worlds of creation as our relatives, and that we have a relationship with all of them. And we're dependent on all of them. The world of the plant world could live really well without us. They are not dependent on human beings, but human beings are dependent on the plant world. In fact, we're dependent on the rest of creation in order to survive. So we think about that, and we think about we have this ongoing relationship with all of creation. We say all of our relations, all of our relatives are part of that. So it imposes on us a relationship and how we conduct ourselves with the rest of creation, because they're like our cousins. So we need to act towards creation in a particular way. And that's pretty much foundational for most indigenous peoples. It really starts with that idea of that interconnectedness with all of creation. And it's been that way for since time immemorial. That's what we call, that's how we measure time. We say since time immemorial, we've been taught that. So we think about the time of contact with European explorers coming to the Americas. Our people have been here for tens of thousands of years. When you look at the archaeological evidence, it puts us here 50, 70, sometimes 100,000 years ago. And when the first explorers came here, they talked about this as being unoccupied, as being vacant land. They used even legal terms at that time, like terra nullius, the land is vacant, so it's okay for us to claim it. What they were saying is that it was occupied by people that were different than them. And, you know, I read this in a history textbook, and it talked about that time of contact. It said for thousands of centuries in which humankind were evolving, forming communities, and building the beginnings of national civilizations in Africa, Asia, and Europe, America stood empty of mankind and its works. Europeans in the New World is the story of the creation of a civilization where none existed. So this is the story that people have been telling themselves for a long time, for hundreds of years, that there was no civilization here at the time of contact, and we know that's not true. We know that there was hundreds and thousands of different types of civilizations. We know that there were city-states in the Americas, the size of the largest cities in Europe at the time of contact. We know that there was forms of technology that were here. We know that there was ways that people, you know, fed themselves and took care of waste and taught their children and celebrated their relationship with the rest of creation and celebrated their relationship with the Creator. That was all here. I mean, that was civilization, but people wanted our land. And that's been really a big part of the history of colonization here in the Americas. And in particular, we'll talk about Canada. And it's colonization that we're talking about. And we're in this process of figuring out, like, what do we do about colonization? I mean, we have all the earmarks of colonization still present. We have an Indian Act. We have a piece of federal law that governs First Nation people, Indian people. And so we've been in a state of colonization for some time. And part of reconciliation is kind of figuring out, how do we move on from that? And what does Canada look like as we move away from colonization and we look at, you know, full expression of Indigenous rights and Indigenous sovereignty? But this idea of the people that were here, there was even debates about whether or not we were human beings. This was debated in the different courts in Europe and at the Vatican, and it was just, you know, found out that yes, we were human beings, but we weren't Christian, so therefore we were uncivilized. So it was okay to take our land. Almost no matter what the question was, the answer would end up being, it's okay to take the land. And so this has been a huge point of contention in terms of how lands were taken. We have early treaties going back to the 1600s with European nations. One of them that's of huge significance is called the Two-Row Wampum. And what it shows, if you can just imagine this, it's this belt, this beaded belt. And the beads in the white beads that form the background are meant to be the river or a body of water. And then there's 2 rows of purple beads up here, and 2 rows of purple beads below. And it stands for the European vessel, the first 2 rows of purple beads. And what it says is that all the laws and the languages and the economy, everything that the Europeans, in this case the Dutch, needed to survive, they have in their ship. And likewise in that indigenous canoe, and it was the Iroquois people, the Haudenosaunee people, our laws, our languages, our economies, our ways of life are in our canoe. And what it says is that we're traveling down this river together. We're traveling this river of life together. And we're joined together by 3 rows of beads, which talk about peace and friendship and forever. So we're tied together in peace and in friendship and forever. And we're not to interfere with each other. But we are traveling side by side, and we're in the same body of water. And of course, that's not the way it's happened here in Canada. We haven't honored that idea of friendship and of peace and of not interfering with each other. We've been a people of treaties here in Canada, what's now Canada. In the 1700s, there was people that were going around pretending that they were representing the king and doing some bad deals with Indigenous people. And the king issued this proclamation, 1763, said that's got to stop. That we're going to have a process for entering into treaty. And it's going to be the crown that's going to enter into treaty. And what he said in that proclamation, he talked about the nations, the several nations or tribes of Indians with whom we are connected. So that idea has been around for a long time. We are indigenous nations in this country. And we've been nations since time immemorial. We're nations now, and we're going to be nations into the future. So part of this job of reconciliation is to figure out, how do the different nations in this country relate to each other? How do the different forms of rights and sovereignties, how do they relate to each other? And this Royal Proclamation can help us understand that. It talked about that the Indigenous people should not be molested or disturbed in the possession of their lands or territories. That would be a good place to start. So we're given some guidance there. And it also talks about that if the land hasn't been ceded by treaty or purchased by the crown, it's Indian land. So there's all different places in Canada that remain Indian land, not just the Indian reserves, but other places are Aboriginal title, it's Indian land. And so this is part of our job too in reconciliation, is to figure out, how do the different land regimes relate to each other? And how can we ensure that Indigenous people have the benefit from their traditional territories, from their traditional lands? These are hard subjects to work through, but they're subjects that we need to work through in order to ensure that everybody is able to prosper and to live well. So we've been making treaty with each other, many of which haven't been lived up to by the Crown, by Canada in particular, because it's Canada that makes treaty with Indigenous people. Provinces don't have the authority to do that. It's a federal Crown authority. So we've been doing that for some time. We're going through processes of understanding, what do some of the historical treaties mean today? Some of the treaties maybe in the 1800s that talked about Indigenous people should have a right to a medicine chest. What does that mean now? Does that mean we have a right to a hospital? Or is it a doctor that comes to the community once a month? Like, we don't know. So we're sorting these types of things out. And likewise, many other things that talk about economy are part of treaty. But fundamentally, treaty talks about nations entering into agreements with each other. And so we need to, as part of our reconciliation process in Canada, is to renew these relationships, these historic relationships that we have with each other, and that vision that our ancestors had in terms of relating to each other much differently than what's happened. So we had all of this, then we get up to Confederation, and things change just dramatically. Canada acted very much like an imperial government. Soon after Confederation, like the second piece of law that got passed in Canada was the Indian Act. And it was an act that was put in place to control First Nation people, Indigenous people right across this country. Parts of it restricted movement. So we even had to have permission to leave our reserve. We had to have permission to sell our goods, to go to market and sell our produce or in the nearest town. It was really controlling in Indigenous people. Residential schools was part of this. And, you know, in almost all the treaties, this issue of education was put in there. Our people recognized the importance of education and wanted to ensure that our kids received a proper education. And there was many experiments that were done in education. Maybe I'll just mention a couple other things about the Indian Act just to demonstrate how terrible this piece of legislation was. Our own ceremonies were outlawed, so it was illegal to practice our spirituality. We could not own our own reserve land. We couldn't own or manage our own money. Indian women or Indigenous women couldn't vote. Even in our own communities, women weren't allowed to vote. We weren't allowed to hire lawyers. So it was a very racist and terrible piece of legislation that still exists. There's been a lot of changes to try to make it better. But just the fact that we have an Indian Act in Canada that other countries even looked at. I mean, South Africa looked at the Indian Act in Canada and took inspiration from it to put in place the apartheid regime in South Africa. So that gives you an idea of how this act has worked to try to control First Nation people and try to prevent our development. And like I say, the government's made some changes. There's still discrimination in the Indian Act, and just by virtue of having an Indian Act, really to me is a black eye for Canada internationally. When we're talking about internationally, we're talking about human rights. Internationally, we're talking about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And then here at home, we have this terrible piece of legislation. So I want to talk to you a bit about residential schools. And like I said at the start, when we put the settlement agreement in place for Indian residential schools, one of the things we talked about for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was the idea that it's not intended to name and to blame and to shame. So that's what I try to do in terms of when I teach these subjects and when I give talks like the one I'm doing today. I'm not trying to blame you. I'm not trying to shame you in terms of what's happened. That in fact, it would be really hard to build reconciliation on shame and blame, that we need to find other ways of relating to each other that can build that firm foundation for reconciliation. You know, I had mentioned the importance of education. Prior to residential schools, there have been different experiments on education. And in most parts, it was a collaboration between the church and government to do that work. Prior to residential schools, there was these schools called industrial schools. And at these schools, boys were taught how to maybe farm or perhaps do carpentry and some academic part. And girls were taught how to cook or how to sew and how to take care of a house and some academic part. But again, it was a collaboration between the church and government. So it was also about assimilating Indigenous children, civilizing Indigenous children, and starting to separate children from their family and from their land. And most of these schools were close to our communities. Some were right in our communities. And so after a while, the churches, they wrote to the government, they said, this experiment's not working. One of the quotes was that they said the wigwam was stronger than the classroom, which meant that all the good work being done during the day to Christianize and civilize and assimilate Indigenous children was being undone at night when they went home to their loving families, to their moms and their dads and brothers and sisters and cousins. And they said, so we have to remove these children from the influence of their family. So out of that, residential schools was born the idea that we're going to separate these children from their families. And children were taken sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles away from their home community. And remember, this is started off in the 1800s. 1828 was the first residential school. And it was just down the road from where I live in Brantford, Ontario. It was called the Mohawk Institute. And schools popped up all over the country. And again, there were a collaboration between the government of Canada and churches, the Roman Catholic Church and their various orders. So maybe the nuns, like the Grey Nuns or the Franciscan Fathers, all these different orders ran about 70 to 75% of all the residential schools. And then the Anglican Church and Presbyterian, Protestant, Methodist, different sects of Christianity ran different schools. The last school closed in 1996. That was the Gordon Indian Residential Schools out in Saskatchewan. So the enrollment was mandatory. It was law that First Nations children under the age of 16 would be removed from their homes, some as young as 4 years old. So we found out actually as some were 3 years old that got taken from their children. So just imagine that, like a 3-year-old child, 4-year-old child being taken from your home and being moved by the government, maybe a couple hundred miles away from where you live. And you're really poor, and you don't have a car, and you know, maybe the road systems aren't very good anyway. You don't even get a chance to see your children on a regular basis, maybe once a year. That's what was happening for 150 years here in Canada, these children being removed. And there was resistance to this. In some places, people would go to the mountains or go out to the bush, into the forest to hide their children. But again, it was the law. So you could go to jail for trying to protect their children. So it was a system that really preyed on powerless people. One of the things that got said about this system was it was intended to kill the Indian in the child. Kill the Indian in the child. So there was something so wrong with Indianness, with our way of thinking, our way of believing, our spirituality, that had to be killed within the child. That was the purpose of residential school, to kill the Indian in the child. Prime Minister Harper acknowledged that in his historic apology in 2008. So we had about 150,000 children went through these schools, primarily First Nation children, but there was some Inuit as well, no question about that, and some Métis. And again, the purpose to Christianize, civilize, assimilate these children into the broader part of Canada. There was high mortality rates, and we're finding that out more and more at many of these schools due to malnutrition or unsanitary conditions, or people with diseases being put into dormitories with healthy kids, and then everybody gets sick, and that happened. We know that in cases, sometimes the church would write to the government and say, we need more money because the school, the girls' dormitory needs to be repaired because the winter winds just come right in there and children get sick. And oftentimes they would get turned down. So those conditions continue to exist. We know that in some schools, in some decades, that the mortality rate, the death rate, was as high as 50%. So a 50% chance that your child goes to school and they die at school. And so we're hearing these stories more and more, but survivors have talked about these for years. They talked about it before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission started. They talked about it to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. When I was doing the work to set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we were hearing about this because we went out to meet with survivors about what their expectations were. And oftentimes, survivors would start to disclose, start to tell their stories. And oftentimes, stories talked about children dying at school and unmarked burials and children being forced to bury other children. A couple years ago, as Maliha noted in her introduction, I worked with National Chief Barry Bellegarde, and we were meeting with some chiefs from Saskatchewan and some folks from from Carleton University in Ottawa. And they were doing work together on the last residential school in Saskatchewan that was still standing. And the idea was that they were talking about, can we make this into a museum or maybe a tourist place where people would come and learn? Could it be a monument? What are the different things we could do? And so they wanted to ensure that the structure, that school structure itself, was sound. So they were using ground penetrating radar to check the foundation all around that school. And they found these little bundles in the earth. Their ground penetrating radar showed that. And then they dug down and they found those bundles were little babies that had been buried there, right along the foundation of the school. I think there was 13 of them. So this happened right across the country. Unmarked burials. Sometimes parents wouldn't find out that their child had died maybe for a year. In many of the graveyards, the burials had no marking. So those records don't exist in some cases. Some places there's pretty good records. We ended up doing a study about this that we gave to the TRC when it got established. But we had worked with archivists from the different churches and from government to examine this issue, because it was being talked about in Parliament in 2006. In the Canadian Parliament, they were talking about unmarked burials and missing children. So this has been part of our history for a long time. And we've talked about it pretty quietly for a long time. But now those voices have been raised. Those unmarked burials and other burials have been uncovered. And we're being shown as a country some of the truths that we were blind to as a country. And it's being forced upon us to understand these truths. And I think it's important. It's like those little children, those spirits of the spirits of those children. It's like they're guiding us to discover new things about ourselves as individuals and as a country. And I think it's going to help us grow as individuals and as a country. And it's going to be painful. I mean, that's people, we already see that. We see that in First Nation communities, Inuit communities, Métis communities, that pain that people are going through, the grief that people are going through with these graves being uncovered. But we see it with other people in Canada too. And I've heard this from friends and family, and you see this on social media. It's impacted a lot of people in Canada and made all of us sit back and think about, God, how did this happen? How did this happen in Canada? I mean, we're so proud of Canada in terms of being this international symbol of human rights and goodness. And we do a lot of good things. There's no question about that. But how do we let this happen in our own backyard? And what are we going to do about it? And I think it's going to require a lot of patience and kindness and love for each other to figure out a way forward. This is, there's no template for this. It's not easy, there's no question about that. But it's an opportunity for us to learn together and to figure out a different future together. We know in these schools there was experiments that were done on children, nutritional experiments, because they were considered an ideal scientific laboratory. I mean, these different abuses are being revealed. Some were revealed by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which did an incredible job. I just really honor the commissioners, their staff, and all the people that came forward to tell their own history, because it's now part of our history as a country, and it's important that we find out these truths. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission said this was cultural genocide, which happened. Former Prime Minister Paul Martin talked about it. Beverly McLaughlin, former Supreme Court Justice, talked about it before the TRC did. And you know, there's many different kinds of genocide that people talk about. And cultural genocide talks about land being seized, languages are banned, spiritual leaders are persecuted, spiritual practices are forbidden, but most significantly, families are disrupted to prevent the transmission of cultural values and identity from one generation to the next. So this is what was happening in Canada through the work of through the work of residential schools, that idea of preventing the transmission of cultural values and identity from one generation to the next. Kids were being taught a different culture and a different identity in these schools. And that continued on past residential schools with forced adoptions, where kids were taken from their homes and adopted out to non-Indigenous homes right across Canada, and in fact in different parts of the world. So there's been almost this campaign since the time Canada's been Canada, of separating Indigenous children from their families, from implementing that idea of killing the Indian in the child. And it's time for that to stop, because some of that is still going on through the child welfare system in this country, and that power being put in the hands of provinces and children's aid societies rather than in our own communities. That's got to stop. And it's in our power to do that. We have legislation in place now. Maliha talked about one piece of that legislation, but it's incredible to me that, we had operated as a country for, 160 some years, and finally agreed that First Nation, Inuit, and Métis parents and communities should have some rights with respect to their children. It's taken us that long to get to that. So we've had this cultural genocide that's been happening. We've had apologies for what's happened. One of the apologies that I found really profound was an apology from the primate of the Anglican Church of Canada. And what he said to residential school survivors and to their families, he said, "We failed you, we failed God, and we failed ourselves." So I said to him, I think that's incredible what your apology was. He goes, "Well, why? Why did you think that?" And I said, "To say we failed God." I said, that's pretty significant. He said, "We have to say that to make it really clear how important and how central this issue is for us as a church to deal with, and to make sure that our members know that this is so significant." So as a country, we're on this path of reconciliation, trying to create respectful relationships with each other. And it's going to take some time. It took us a long time to get into the position that we're in right now. So it's not going to happen overnight. But it really does require good people being willing to reach out, to join together, join hands together, to stand shoulder to shoulder, to help develop a different vision of this country based on respect. It requires creating understanding. I'm so happy that I'm part of this today, because it's hopefully part of creating understanding between the Tamil community and Indigenous people. And I really want to encourage you to keep learning, to keep developing understanding, and that's part of that's part of what's going to make this journey of reconciliation that much stronger, is understanding each other more and more. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission said reconciliation is not an Indigenous issue, it's a Canadian one. I kind of think about it as a Canadian opportunity, not so much just an issue. And we're faced with many challenges right now in the world. One of the challenges that we're faced here in Canada is how do we move from this colonial structure into something that's that's different? What does a post colonial structure look like? How are we going to do power sharing differently? How are we going to share resources differently? These are all questions, and it's up to us to come up with the answers, um, because there is no template for doing this. We're going to create it together. Prime Minister Trudeau said no relationship is more important than the relationship with Indigenous people. He said our government is working together to build a nation to nation, Inuit Crown, government to government relationships based on respect, partnership, and recognition of rights. That's what we're doing. Gord Downie, who I just love so much, and who wrote those songs, the Secret Past songs, about residential schools and about Cheney Winjack in particular, that young man that escaped from residential school and died trying to make his way home. And Gord Downie was so moved by that. He really spent the last few years of his life working on bringing knowledge of residential schools and bringing hope um, for the future of Canada. And what he said, he challenged all of us. He said, just do something. Just do something. And we can all do something. We can all choose to read a book or to create new understandings, to find ways of reaching out. Today is doing something. The walkathon is doing something. I'm just really so happy to be part of all of this right now, because it's inspirational at a time when in this country we really need that hope, and we need those symbols of inspiration and of goodness. So that's the journey that we're on right now. I just want to maybe say a couple more words and then close and turn things back over to our MC. But I think one of the things that I think is fundamental in terms of moving forward is this idea that we need to be working together. We hosted this meeting a few years back at the University of Alberta on Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And one of the speakers there, he said that Truth and Reconciliation Commissions were like spring ice. And, you know, you go out in the springtime, sometimes in the fall too, and maybe there's a little puddle near your house or a pond, and that ice is really, really thin. It's really fragile. And if you just try to grab it, it just crumbles in your hand. And he said that's what Truth and Reconciliation Commissions are like. It's like that fragile. He said, but if you can get a bunch of hands together and you hold up that ice, you hold it up to the sun, you see all these colors come bursting through. It's like a giant rainbow. And he said, but if anybody just tries to grab it for themselves, it crumbles on all of us. He says, so it really requires that respect for each other and that kindness and that gentleness and that love to be able to hold that ice. And I think about the work of the TRC. These calls to action, I think, are like that spring ice, that it really does require us to put our hands together and to lift up those calls to action, to lift up that spring ice, so that possibility, that beauty, that love, and that great opportunity for us in this country really shines through and shines on all of us, and inspires all of us to do something. So I want to thank you very much for allowing me time to talk about these issues, and look forward to the next little part of our program in terms of questions and answers. So Chimigwech, Nyawago, thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much. Huge thanks to Professor Bob Watts for your time, for your thoughts and your words at the event. So much to take away from your presentation for me personally and for all of us, because I felt like your stories painted a huge amount of pictures for us, so many pictures and segments, and um, it felt like just the unfairness and the pain and the sickening realities of so many Indigenous people and their families, and everything that was gone through for generations upon generations was coming out and just pouring out for us. We're still uncovering all this today, as you said, but there are so many Indigenous people that we lost that we can't even hear from them. They're not even here to share their tragedies and experiences and horrifying realities. So it's uncomfortable, but it's more than uncomfortable. It's more than unsettling for us to hear about the truth and about the land that we've been embracing as many of us here, Tamil Canadians, have been here for, and our parents came here for. It's a much needed history lesson, and I'm so thankful to have heard it in your words, someone from the community, to talk about the shift that we're going through and understanding how different history is from what we've been told all this time, and what's been written in books and what's been passed down for immigrant generations and for people who've settled on this land for so long as well. This is an acknowledgement, as you said, you've put such hopeful tones into to your words and your presentation. It's a real reflection on the kind of climate that we're living in right now, and the kind of way and the kind of like spirit that we bring into this climate today is what's going to be moving us forward in a positive way, in a very learned way, for us to continue sharing bonds with each other and educating ourselves, and really to create better circumstances for everybody in the Indigenous community and beyond. So thank you again for putting that loving and hopeful energy into the somber times that we're living in, because it's really important. You're tuned into Indian Residential Schools Legacy, and this is a speaker series with Mr. Bob Watts, organized by the Canadian Tamil Congress. And it's time for, as you said, Bob, our Q&A portion of today. It's going to be about 20 minutes, and I'm going to moderate this alongside Miss Malika Wilson, and we're really hoping for some engagement and participant from our listeners and viewers today. And we do have a whole bunch of people who've asked some thoughtful and engaging questions so far. So we'll try and answer everything, but let's see what we can get to. And Rob, I thought that we could start with a listener question, actually, because this goes back to some of the things that you were saying about treaties signed within the Aboriginal communities and tribes before the Canadian government stepped in, from what I could remember and take away from it. So this is a question from Dr. Shun Mukhavadivel. So his question is, were there treaties signed with colonial regimes prior to Canadian governments? And this might be a bit of a review, but if you could briefly talk on this.
Good. Well, thank you for your general comments, Ramya. I really appreciate that feedback, and thank you, Doctor, for your question. So yeah, there was treaties. We call them pre-Confederation treaties that were signed with the British government, some with the French government in Canada, what's now Canada. What was clear at the time of Confederation was that those responsibilities that the British Crown had, and the British assumed some of the French Crown responsibilities, were transferred to Canada. A lot of our people still celebrate our relationship with the Queen of England, because we feel that we have a historical and treaty relationship with the Queen. But at the time of Confederation, that was part of the deal, was those responsibilities were transferred to Canada. So the treaties didn't disappear, the relationship changed. And like I was saying, we're still trying to sort through some of those questions of relationship and what do those words mean. And this has gone to the Supreme Court, I don't know how many times, but one of the things the Supreme Court said was really important was the spirit and intent of the treaty had to be honored. And the idea that in interpreting the treaty, part of the interpretation has to be what was the Indigenous understanding of treaty. And thirdly, this is, I think, really significant, not just in Canada, but maybe for other parts of the world, that oral oral testimony, oral history has the same weight as written history. So sometimes, they say that there's so much power in the historian's pen that they write down what had happened, and but there's another history too. That's the history that we've been telling our children and our grandchildren and great grandchildren for all this time. And the court said that has to be considered right along with written history. So it's the Supreme Court has been really good, I think, in terms of helping to sort through some of these difficult treaty questions. Still a lot of unanswered questions, but we've got some good guidance.
Ramya, would you like me? I'll ask the next question. Bob, the question is, where do we go from here? So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did a great job. There's no doubt about it. But with the discovery of these mass graves, which is frankly shocking and very sad, Canadians have been confronted with a very ugly past. And the word ugly doesn't really capture what it is. Minimum cultural genocide. So where does the Aboriginal community see this going? Where is the accountability? And how can Canada judge itself when the state itself perpetuated these atrocities?
Yeah, those are really great questions, Maliha. I think we're going to go through a time for the next several years of we're going to hear more and more. We're going to hear other stories about other unmarked burials at other residential schools. This is going to be part of what we're going to experience as a country. And there's going to be need for space created for grieving for that and for repatriation, for bringing those children home to be reburied in community. That's going to have to be part of the process. And then this question of accountability is a really great question. I know that folks are looking at criminal liability and whether or not, as you noted, should be somebody outside of Canada that helps adjudicate that criminal behavior, either on the part of the church or the government of Canada or their employees. So these are going to be some tough questions to sort through. There's no statute of limitations on those criminal activities. So Canada's courts could look at them right now, and they have in some cases, but it's been very few court cases have gone forward in this era. Sometimes it's because of the way that the justice system is set up, it almost mitigates against justice. So maybe we need to think of a different way of achieving justice rather than just sort of applying criminal standards to examining these issues. And so I think it's going to force us as a country and as Indigenous people to think deeply about what is the proper forum for adjudicating some of these issues, and what are some of the standards that need to be applied in terms of trying to seek justice. And I think it'll be different. I think it won't be just a criminal court system, and I think it won't be just people going to jail or people going to prison. There's going to be other ways of thinking about what does justice look like in these areas, and we're going to have to think deeply about it. It's actually a bit of an opportunity in some ways for us to think outside of this box that we built for ourselves in this country.
I really love that through your presentation, you got to the point where you were talking about no blame and no shame. And this is, I think, pointing towards the kind of collaboration that we could really see and develop with each other. So we have some questions that kind of ask about our role as Tamil Canadians. So this is a question from Vasan Petamish, and he asks, how do you perceive the Canadian Tamil Congress's involvement in the relationship with First Nations people? And what do you think that CTC should do additionally? And this is an add-on to that question from Dilshan Navaratna Raja. And he says, thank you, Bob, for taking your time to speak to all of us today about the Indigenous people's issues in Canada, and how can we, the Tamil Congress, that has always advocated for the equality, peace, and reconciliation, has made every effort to connect and stay connected with the Indigenous people, do more? How can we do more and be part of this process moving forward? Do you have any specific advice for us and other organizations here in Canada?
Well, those are great questions. I think first of all, making sure through efforts that you're presently undertaking, making sure that the Indigenous community and the rest of the country know that the Tamil community is standing shoulder to shoulder with Indigenous people, and going to support Indigenous people in this journey of reconciliation. We're going to be brothers and sisters in this journey. That's powerful all by itself. And I think that calling upon government representatives, members of parliament, MPPs, and making sure that they know that the Tamil community is standing shoulder to shoulder with Indigenous people and that you expect action. That because I can tell you from working in Ottawa, I don't know how many times I've heard politicians say, well, you know, Bob, these clearly are really important issues, but you know, they don't appear to be important at all to my constituency. So if they're not important, then I'm not going to work on it. And one, I just say that is such poor leadership, but also creates an opportunity for all of you to knock on the when that MP comes along. Maybe we're going to have an election in September. When they come along and say, I would like your vote, I would say to them, what are you going to do in terms of advocating for the rights of Indigenous people, ensuring justice with respect to the unmarked burials and these bodies that are being discovered? What are you going to do, and what is your party going to do? And the answer to that is going to help me decide who I'm going to vote for. Maybe creating forums. I mean, if we do have a federal election in the next month and a half, having the Tamil community create forums and inviting all these people that want your vote to come and ask them these questions as part of a debate. In every community across this country, every major community, there's an Indian or a Métis or Inuit Friendship Center. There's organizations there that are trying desperately to create good living conditions for Indigenous people, whether it's in Toronto or Ottawa or Vancouver, right across the country. You can reach out to those communities. 16 Spadina Road in Toronto is the Native Canadian Center, and just going and saying, you know, we're from the Tamil community here in Toronto. What can we do to help? And you'll probably get a lot of answers. Same with in rural and settings in the country. You know, I've worked in communities where you have a First Nation, you know, right along the road, and there's a town sometimes maybe 20 miles away. They're like strangers to each other. Well, that's one of the things that we need to do, is not be strangers. And wouldn't it be wonderful if the Tamil community really became leaders in showing the entire country how not to be strangers with each other? I just think that would be so fabulous. So I could go through a whole list of things, but you know, I think just, you know, holding people to account and going out and making sure people know that you're standing with them. That's powerful. That's really powerful.
Bob, the next question is mine. You spoke a bit about this, about the Indian Act being a colonial piece of legislation. There's been some amendments made, but really not once I go to the foundational level. What we know the aspiration is self-government. Where do you think it should go, and what are the circumstances in terms of a new regime, and what are the circumstances that will actually bring this about?
That's that's a great question. I mean, the government of Canada just passed a piece of law called Bill C-15, which was recognizing the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And that bill, that declaration talks about the right of self-determination, the right of self-government. So we're already in that paradigm. Part of reconciliation is ensuring that Indigenous communities, have the ability to represent themselves and to govern themselves and not be under the yoke of the Indian Act. So it needs to be done away with. But it needs to be done away with at the pace that Indigenous people demand. I've seen and heard from a number of ministers of Indian Affairs or ministers of Justice, and they want to dictate the schedule and they want to dictate the terms and conditions. It's not up to them to dictate either. It should be the Indigenous people that set the pace of decolonization in this country. And the face of decolonization is the Indian Act. There's no doubt about that. And it should be at our pace. And we will put our own structures in place of self-government that anybody would be proud of living under. I mean, we don't want to live under horrible regimes. Somehow we're imagining that it would be a step backwards for our communities to govern themselves. I mean, that's what people have been saying for decades. No, like, who cares more about our people than our people? Nobody. So we're going to have regimes that really honor and respect ourselves. But it should be done at our pace, because not all of our communities are at the same level. Not all of our communities have the same capacity. We're going to figure that out, and the government needs to make space for that to happen and to be willing to work at our pace. Those are the prerequisites.
Bob, I want to jump into another, part of how we can move reconciliation forward, and it's with the involvement of younger people and youth, aka my age group. So this is a question from Tira Kumar, and he wants to know how far the younger generation is getting involved in the reconciliation process, and if there's any action on the bigger level with leaders and politicians getting involved with wanting younger people and having specific direction for us to get involved with, because I feel like the type of engagement might be a little different than usual, right? To try to get younger people involved in recognizing and acknowledging what's been going on with Indigenous communities and Indigenous history.
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the things that I get a lot of inspiration from is teaching. It's like I look forward to that so much because of the energy of the energy of young people, and that really drive to be part of change. How that happens, I mean, again, with the different centers that I mentioned, like the Native Canadian Center in Toronto, or some of the friendship centers in the different cities across the country, they all have youth programming. And so there's opportunities for youth to work with youth right across the country. One of the things that I'd be happy to do is to figure out, because I think we're going to have a relationship between the Congress and the Downie-Winjack Fund. We do a lot of work with youth. And so one of the commitments that I'll make is to figure out a way of the Downie-Winjack Fund and the Congress being able to join some forces to inspire youth to work together. probably 70% of the work that Downey Wenjack does is really directed at youth. And so, again, reaching out to organizations where you live and connecting youth that way, I think would be great. And then, like I say, I'll work with some of the leadership within the Congress to make those other connections.
Thank you. And I did want to jump in here and say we have just over 10 minutes or so to wrap up our conversation. So Maliha, maybe you can ask one last question and then we can get to some closing remarks with Mr. Watts.
Okay, just a short question. One of the other issues, apart from governance, that we've had to deal with, Indigenous people have had to deal with, is the whole rights-based decision-making process that exists in Canada, the judiciary playing a large part. So while the Supreme Court itself has created laws which are somewhat helpful, but at the same time, the fundamental question of the land rights that belong to First Nations has not been determined. And in fact, to win a case on land claims is pretty hard. One of the issues is the composition of the judiciary. There are hardly any Indigenous judges. How do you see that being fixed? This is part of the short-term solution, right, until you get to full self-government.
We've gone, that's a great question. I mean, we've gone through a few different processes to develop land claim processes that kind of force Indigenous people into this kind of tunnel to work with government to figure out claims. And, it's a funny thing because it was all our land in the first instance. And now we need to go to court or other tribunals to prove that it was either our land in the first instance or there's some residual rights or other sort of rights that we have with respect to that land. And we have a number of different scenarios out there. We have the this land back movement that's going on where, and this is, a lot of young people are involved with this, of people demanding that our land be returned to us. And land back has a few different definitions. Some of it is like, we want our land back, period. Some of it is, we want to be involved with co-managing our traditional territories. Some of it is, we want to be able to benefit from our traditional territories. So land back has a few different definitions depending on who you talk to. I don't know whether, again, it's one of those things where I don't know whether the justice system in and of itself is the proper place to be able to sort through these issues. And it seems that we have a hard time politically trying to sort through these issues. Most of our politicians would rather have the court say, yes, you owe Indigenous people X amount of money because you stole their land, rather than standing up and saying, we stole their land and we owe them some money. It's like, well, politically, that's a hard thing to do. It's better to have the court say that, because then we can say, it's not us, it's the court that's in it. And so we're stuck in this weird world of yes, it's the right thing to do, but if you do the right thing, then sometimes Canadians may not like it. And that's been true for a lot of Indigenous issues, is doing the right thing. Sometimes Canadians don't like it because it impacts on the pocketbook or something. So we have to figure out some proper forms to do this. But I mean, there's no doubt in my mind, through things like UN Declaration and changes that are going to be made in terms of whose hands are on these levers of power, whether it becomes taxation regimes, other fiscal regimes, who manages land. These are going to change. There's no doubt in my mind. And it's going to change to the benefit of Indigenous people. Does that mean that everybody has to leave? No. Does that mean that people are going to be, kicked out of their home? No. But it means that how those decisions are made about everything from taxation to development to pipelines to hydro lines to all those things are going to be different, because our rights need to be taken into account in terms of how those decisions are made.
Thank you, Bob. And on that note, if you have any final words for us before we close for the afternoon, I'd really love to hear him.
Okay, well, thank you. It's been such a honor being part of this. I'm reminded of, I mentioned Gord Downey, who I have such love and respect for. One of the things he said, I think it was in one of his final concerts, he said, the next 100 years are going to be painful as we come to know Cheney Wenjack and thousands like him, as we find out about ourselves, about all of us. But only when we do can we truly call ourselves Canada. And we're already into that. We're coming to know Cheney Wenjack and thousands like him. And it started with that 215 children in Kamloops, and it's become thousands. And the same thing is going on in the US now with the boarding school system that was in place there. And, former Governor General Michaela Jean, she talked about the need for us to confront history together. And that by confronting history together, we're going to create a different kind of Canada. And what we're doing in our way of thinking and decision making, we like to think of either something like a 5-generation or a 7-generation decision making model. That idea that to think through, how is this going to impact on our great grandchildren, these decisions that we're making today. And I think we have that opportunity. I kind of feel that that's part of what we've already done here today, is that we say, with our grandchildren and our great grandchildren, when they look back on what we're doing, when they look back on this efforts that we've made, would they be proud of us? And to me, that's part of the challenge. With those coming faces, would they be proud of what we're doing? And it requires that leadership. When I've heard, the president talk, I got a chance to speak with him a bit yesterday, and to hear his comments today. One of the things that gets talked about is we need a different type of moral leadership in this country. And that's what I sense from those conversations that I've had, is a different kind of moral leadership. And one of the things that we learned in setting up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is this idea, we call it manifest the outcomes you're trying to achieve. So if you're trying to achieve justice, you can't do it in an unjust way. If you're trying to achieve cooperation, you can't do it by operating in an uncooperative way. So if we're trying to achieve reconciliation, we need to be operating in a manner that manifests reconciliation. And there's no single definition of reconciliation, but surely it's about respect, and it's about dignity, and ensuring dignity for all of us, and ensuring honor for all of us. All of these things are critical in terms of moving forward. I got accused a few years ago of seeing the world with rose-colored glasses, and saying, the person said, reconciliation will never happen. You just look at the world like through. And I said, you know what? This was in a university setting, and I said, I just want to tell you a quick story. I said, I was at Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa a few years ago, and they were unveiling an exhibit about residential schools. and a colleague of mine came and sat beside me. We were the first two there. I think we thought they were going to have like free coffee, but they didn't. But anyways, we were like the first two there, and he sits beside me and he goes, "Bob, I got to tell you something." I go, what is it?" And he says, "Something really amazing happened on the weekend." He said, I said, what happened? He said, "Oh, I told my daughter I loved her." And he was about 55 or so, and his daughter was about 30. And I said, "Well, that's really nice." And he goes, "No, no." He says, "You don't understand." He said, "It was the first time I told her I loved her." I said, "Really? First time?" And he goes, "Yeah." He goes, "My grandparents went to residential school. My parents went to residential school. I went to residential school. Nobody ever told me they loved me growing up. So I didn't know it was part of the deal." He said, "But when I saw her reaction and I felt the way I felt, I just go tell her I love her all the time." And and so I said, to me, that's reconciliation. Like, is it going to change the country? I don't know. But I think there's all kinds of reconciliations like that happening all the time. What we're done today is part of reconciliation because it's about knowledge, it's about energy, it's about passion, it's about cooperation, it's about all of those things. It's not just about the prime minister and the national chief like hugging on Parliament Hill and we all feel good. No, it's about real people, making some real efforts, and it's not going to be easy. But I think of my friend, and I think about all these small things that we can all do. We can all, as Gord Downey said, we can all do something. So that's what I would encourage you. Just do something, and I look forward to doing something with you as we move down this journey of reconciliation. I'm just so grateful that I've had the time to be with you this afternoon, and I just want to thank the community and the Congress for inviting me into your circle. Miigwech, Nyawagoa, thank you very much, merci.
Thank you. We appreciate you. We appreciate your time, your words. I've been saying my commentary throughout, so I don't want to take up too much time. But Professor Bob Watts joining us with his time and efforts to really encourage us and to have this extremely hopeful vibe throughout the presentation today. Thank you to the president of the Canadian Tamil Congress, Mr. Stephen Ilango, as well as Ms. Malika Wilson for speaking today, and for Malika especially for helping out with moderating our Q&A and putting in her own questions. Thanks to all of you from Canadian Tamil Congress who organized the event and put in the effort really to shed light on our relationship with Indigenous peoples and to talk about reconciliation and the importance of it. I want to also thank our technical team for helping us put this virtual space together, and thank you for attending from across the country and hopefully some more streaming around the world to talk about what's going on, for your engagement, your questions, your commentary. We really appreciate being part of this discussion. I also want to announce that the Canadian Tamil Congress will be hosting a Tamil Canadian walk in support of Gord Downey Wunjak Fund, and this is a for First Nations charity in September 2021. So again, to echo everything else that was said today, really do encourage and hope that you support and continue to support, because it's not just about today. It's not just about the presentation that we had and the conversation we had. We have to really, after we shut down our computers, continue to think about how we can individually support and make the bigger picture happen for reconciliation as we all continue to come together with the intention of listening better to our neighbors and learning more about the people of Canada, about our histories and the stories that we've been told and what we've been hearing, and hopefully we can walk toward a kinder and more generous world, something that is more open and more expressive. We acknowledge that we don't know much and we don't know everybody, but we sure will be willing to learn and listen more. Thank you so much. I'm Ramia Amuddin, and on behalf of the Tamil the Canadian Tamil Congress. I appreciate all of you being here today.